Welcome, everyone. I call the February 13th City Council Committee of the Whole meeting to order. Councilmember Ray has an excused absence this evening. We will continue to have a remote aspect of our meetings, and both staff and members of the public may be participating in tonight's meeting remotely. The first item on the agenda is public comment, and so we have an opportunity for public comment. Clerk, did we have anyone who has signed up previous to speak or who has indicated a desire to speak online?
So no one has signed up in advance to speak. I see one member of the public on the virtual meeting, so just waiting for a quick moment to see if there's a hand raised. And as a reminder, public comment will also be accepted after the staff presentation and council Q&A on each agenda item. And I don't see that anyone online is indicating a desire to speak, nor in person.
Nobody? Okay. Fantastic. We will give opportunities after each of our agenda items. We have 2 agenda items on tonight's meeting. ID 1312, the WSDOT Fish Passage Replacement Project, will be presented. We've got some guests from the Washington Department of Transportation, Tim Now and Chris Olson, along with Matt Ellis, our Utility Engineering Manager. I'm not sure which one of you guys is gonna start us off. Matt, okay, take it away. Thanks.
Hi, good evening. I'm Matt Ellis, Utility Engineering Manager for the City of Issaquah. And give me 1 second while I try to get this going.
Matt, I can pull it up for you.
I have it up. I just need to share screens. Okay.
I'm not yet seeing your, and you're gonna have to mute. Okay, we're starting to see the screen, but it sounds like we've still got the echo. Now testing whether we've got the echo. Okay, we're solving problems over here. Fantastic.
Sorry about that. All right. As I mentioned, I'm here with Tim Now and Chris Olson from the Washington State Department of Transportation. And we're here to talk about the WSDOT Fish Passage Replacement Project. That includes I-90, SR 169, SR 509, and SR 900. And the purpose of this project is to provide an update on WSDOT's project for fish passage replacement. And tonight we'll be asking for some direction. Primarily this meeting will be just to present the project in its whole. There's quite a bit of elements that we wanted to present to council. But part of it will be to ask for input on suggested community engagement opportunities, as well as provide input on city council touch points throughout the project. And there'll be quite a bit at the end of this that we'll discuss. And I'm gonna turn this over to Tim Now and Chris Olson here in just 1 second. I just wanted to mention that there's quite a bit of, there's 4 different areas that we'll be talking about. And if there are specific questions, we can pause the presentation and ask a few questions in the middle. And then at the end, we can go into a little bit more detail. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Tim.
Thank you, Matt. I'd like to thank the council for letting us come and talk to you about this project. Let's start with a little background. In 2013, a federal court injunction ruled that the state of Washington had treaty-based duty to preserve fish runs. The injunction required WSDOT to significantly increase the effort to remove over 700 state-owned culverts that block habitat for 6 haminoids by 2030. This project will replace 16 of these fish passage barriers. The project will replace culverts in 7 locations, 3 inside the city of Issaquah, 1 just outside the city, and the rest are locations on SR 169 near Black Diamond and SR 509 near SeaTac. We're only going to talk about the 4 locations that are in or near the city of Issaquah. For this project, WSDOT is using a design-build-delivery method which encourages contractors to come up with efficiencies, innovation, and cost savings. The design builders determines the details of the work that meets the requirements set forth in the request for proposals. I will provide the best information we have at this time, but some of the details will have to wait until the design builder has been selected and the design builder produces information and a schedule. Construction is scheduled to start in 2024. Work is scheduled to be completed at all sites by 2029. Let's take a close look at how this project has evolved. Work began in 2020 with identifying the crossings to include in this project and evaluating them. In 2021, WSDOT began identifying the impacts with ongoing coordination meetings with Issaquah and other jurisdictions. We are presently working on developing the request for proposals document that will be issued to qualified contractors in the fall of 2023. Under the current schedule, the apparent best value proposer will be announced in early 2024, with construction beginning in summer of 2024. Because of the multiple locations on I-90, SR-169, SR-509, and SR-900, the exact timing of when construction will begin and be complete near Issaquah is unknown. Construction at all locations will be completed in 2029. After the design builder is announced and begin developing construction plans and sequencing, more details about construction timing and road closures will be available. Benefits. Removing the fish barrier is an important element of WSDOT's commitment to help salmon recovery. There are many reasons why barriers need to be removed. The culverts in this project hit all of the issues noted in the graphic. Most notably, water that flows too fast or too slow, shallow water in the pools below the culvert and in the culvert itself. The culvert is just not accessible. WSDOT must replace them with passages that are accessible and provides habitat suitable to the fish at all life stages. This includes covered in the injunction and fish covered by state and local laws. The benefits of removing are significant. In addition to fish being culturally important to tribes as a food, some fish are also a food source for an estimated 100 species, including orca whales. The economic benefits are important as well. They support an estimated 16,000 jobs and generate over $500 million in personal income. Correcting these sites near Issaquah will result in almost 15,000 meters of potential habitat gain. That's 9 more miles of potential habitat to benefit all life stages. The City of Issaquah and WSDOT design team have been working together on this project for 2 years now. This slide includes some of the coordination efforts between the city and WSDOT that has happened or will happen. We have worked closely together on the RFP, including standards, incorporating construction requirements, and impacts on city streets, utility coordination. This will be the ongoing effort throughout the construction to ensure WSDOT and the city remain actively engaged to ensure project success. But it's also worth noting a few limitations for the city, including dictating the schedule, preventing the project from happening, and expanding or reducing the limits. Confidentiality requirements also restrict some of the information that we can provide until after a design builder is selected and a contract is executed. Now I'm going to give you a quick overview of the 4 locations near Issaquah. The first one is Lewis Creek, which is located on the far west edge of the city limits. The second is actually 2 creeks, West Village Park and Snyder Creeks. They are located close to Lake Sammamish. The third location within the city limits is a cluster of culverts called tributaries to Tribbitt's Creek, where SR 900 crosses over I-90. The final location is further south on SR 90 at Tibbetts Creek, just outside the city limits. Once again, it's important for you to keep in mind that specific details about the design for each site, when closures will occur, and how long they'll last won't be known until the design builder submits their design and construction schedule. But it's also worth noting all design, traffic control plans, and other submittals that affect Issaquah streets will be submitted to the city for comments. Now we're going to take a closer look at each site, starting with Lewis Creek on the west boundary of Issaquah. The existing culvert is the orange line. The green line is the proposed new alignment. Keep in mind that the design builder can propose another alignment. We don't expect it to be much different than what we have here. There's been a lot of coordination with the Fish Passage Program co-managers to get these alignments. Changing the alignments would require the design builder to get new approvals, which is not easy. Due to elevation and alignment changes, WSDOT will also replace the culvert section near Newport Way and Westlake Sammamish Parkway. As you can see on this map, Newport and I-90 eastbound on the ramp intersection will be relocated to a roundabout added. You can barely see the roundabout there. There will be a new bridge between Lakemont and the roundabout. We determined that designing and building a bridge that had enough room for the creek under it and an intersection on top of it would be too difficult. A better solution was to move the intersection and add the roundabout. Here's a summary of what will happen at Lewis Creek. There will be 2 new bridges on I-90. Work will need to be phased because we will not allow a full closure of I-90. Phasing will still be difficult. We expect the design builder will shift I-90 lanes toward the median and reduce the number of through lanes available. This allows them to build half of a bridge at a time in one direction, then swap and work in the other direction. And we cannot say at this time how long lane reductions on I-90 will last. On Westlake Sammamish Parkway, there is not enough freeboard for Lewis Creek under the road. The roadway will be raised to meet minimum freeboard and a new bridge built. We have a preliminary design that only impacts one driveway, and we are working with that property owner on a new driveway design. To complete a fish passage, Westlake Sammamish Parkway will be fully closed for a limited amount of time and a detour will be signed. On Newport Way, building the new bridge will require a full closure of the roadway for a limited amount of time. There will be a detour. Building the roundabout will not require an additional closure of Newport Way. Please note that Newport Way and Westlake Sammamish Parkway will not be closed at the same time. In summary, the work on Lewis should take 2 to 3 years. When completed, there will be 4 new bridges and new roundabout. Work will require I-90 lane reductions, street closures, and detours. We have been working with local utilities. And one last topic for this area. With the relocation of Newport Way intersection, the WSDOT limited access in this area will need to be adjusted. Being so close to Lakemont Boulevard, Newport Way intersection creates some additional issues that we're currently working through. At this time, we will pause for a couple of questions, if anyone has any for this area.
We do have a question. Councilmember DiMichele.
Thank you. Thanks for all this information. Really appreciate it. And this might be a question for Matt. They've had a lot of work out there on the Westlake Sammamish Parkway for a number of years now, and all those new sound barriers have gone up. And I'm just wondering if this construction is going to disturb any of that work, or will it be basically going under all the work that's been done?
That is a good question. Actually, the next set of slides will talk about that portion that the sound barriers were installed. And I don't believe there will be any impact to the sound walls themselves because of the reroute that WSDOT is proposing. That'll be in the West Village Park and Schneider Creek section.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're good with questions on Lewis Creek, and you can continue.
Thank you. Moving on to West Village and Snyder Creeks. The existing culverts are in the orange lines again. The green line is the proposed new alignment. This is a major alignment change for West Village Park Creek. The existing culvert is way too steep, and trying to keep the creek near the existing alignment creates a creek that is still too steep. To fix it, West Village Park Creek will be realigned along WSDOT right-of-way on the south side of I-90. It will then merge with Snyder Creek and cross I-90. We will then create a new alignment for a better stream channel to Lake Sammamish. Again, due to elevation and alignment changes, WSDOT will need to replace the culvert sections under Newport Way and Northwest Sammamish Road. Here's a summary of the planned work. 2 new bridges on 9A will allow the combined creeks to flow under the interstate. I-90 will need to be raised to meet the freeboard requirements. Work will need to be phased and with lane reductions and shifting of the lanes to allow the contractor to work in one direction at a time. The combined creek will flow under Northwest Sammamish Road, which will also have a new bridge. Northwest Sammamish Road will be closed to get the work completed and have traffic on the new bridge as soon as possible. Newport Way on the other side of I-90 will also have a new bridge. In combination with Lewis Creek work to the east, no 2 city street closures will be allowed at the same time. We don't want conflicting detours. The work on West Village Park and Snyder Creeks will take 2 to 3 years to complete. When done, there will be 4 new bridges and a new stream alignment. We'll continue to work closely with the city on detour routes, local street closures, and utility impacts. And one last note, we are reviewing the city's project plan for this area to make sure our project is forward compatible with the city projects. At this time, we'll pause for any questions on this site.
Oh,
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Martz.
Thank you. Bringing 2 creeks together has hydrological and limnological implications for flooding and turbidity and all that. How's that assessment going to be done? When we get heavy rains like we have right now, you're going to be having twice the watershed flowing through that new lower creek. How's all that being evaluated?
Sorry. For the part that's actually underneath I-90, where it's going to be quite a bit wider than either one is right now. All these fish passages are a lot wider than the culvert that comes into it. And so the flooding is going to be minor, or the increased flow will be minor. But with the freeboards, we have fairly strict freeboards, upwards of 10 feet above the elevation of the 100-year storm. And that's why I-90 is having to be raised in this section, is that we are looking at those flooding issues, how much. On the north side of I-90, that's already a floodplain for Lake Sammamish. So our little increase is not going to make that much difference in that area. So.
Right. Thank you.
But we do look at flooding downstream. We have restrictions that we have to be within look seriously at 300 feet either side of the stream crossing.
Okay, that looks like all of our questions on this one.
Okay, tributaries to Tibbetts Creek. Moving on to the Tibbetts Creek on the 90 SR 900 interchange. New fish passage structures are going to be built very close to the existing culvert. There will be a total of 7 bridges. 4 on 90, 1 on SR 900 that will also extend over the southbound SR 900 to westbound I-90 ramp. The other on the northbound SR 900 ramp to the westbound I-90, and a bridge on the westbound I-90 off-ramp. We'll also replace a culvert on Gilman Boulevard. This work will also need to be phased to build the new I-90 bridges and the bridges on 900. We anticipate the contractor will reduce lanes on I-90 and shift traffic so they can build one half of the bridge at a time. This will be also true for the SR 900. There will be a limited full closures of the ramps. Ramp closures will not be allowed if it affects the detours of other ramp closures. Work on Gilman Boulevard will be handled similar to SR 900 with lane closures and traffic shifts. Gilman also has a sewer line that we are working with the utility owner to adjust. The work on this area will also take 2 to 3 years to complete. We expect some of this work may overlap with other locations, but we don't expect any 3 locations will be built and completed in the same 2 to 3 year period. Bottom line is the design builder will be required to complete all the project work by the end of 2029. I also want to note that we have regular meetings with the utility owners and are working forward on a plan to handle the utilities. At this time, we'll pause for any questions about this site.
Deputy Council President Hall?
Thank you. Just a quick one. So you've mentioned utility impacts a couple times. Is that just like relocating existing assets, or are we anticipating service interruptions for particular communities?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so you've mentioned utility impacts a couple times. Is that just relocating of existing assets that we have in terms of infrastructure, or is it service interruptions to our community?
We are not sure on, the utilities are going to be in charge of relocating their utilities. So impacts to service, hopefully it's minimized. It's up to them to determine when their best time is. These relocations can be everything from, well, yeah, we have to drop it down, we have to move it over, to, on one of them, we're actually going to be putting in a culvert instead of a bridge so that the utility can stay in the same location, supported while we go and put a culvert underneath it. So that one will be functioning, we'll never lose any time. And so we're a lot of utilities, and each one we're handling a little differently. So case specific.
Matt, do you have anything to add from the city's perspective?
Yeah, so part of our discussions with WSDOT is that we will be able to put in to their RFP, their request for proposal for their design builder, certain requirements for our utilities. So ones that they need to relocate or coordinate on their projects, will have the ability to put in conditions about how long a service disconnection can occur. For our water, there's very strict times that the water can be turned off, or we have enough room in our reservoirs to provide service to customers. And then the Bellevue-Issaquah pipeline will be impacted. They also will have specific conditions and requirements as well, and we're working with them. And then our sewer line will also be impacted, and that will be on us to relocate, but there'll be a workaround.
Okay, and I've got a question. On many of these areas, you're charting an area that on the I-90, we're hoping that ST3, the Sound Transit, light rail will come down. I assume that any bridges or areas that are built would be built to a spec that would support a light rail going down the center of I-90 and wouldn't cause an interruption with that planning.
We are not reducing the median. We have had talked to Sound Transit, or the light rail, and their plans are really tough to design around because they're not of any place really. The closest we have is that it's going down the median. We are not, we're moving over in the median during construction. The lanes are going back to where they are right now when we're done. So we're not widening anything, we're just keeping it in the same location. So that's all temporary. Whatever, and so we should have minimum, if any, impact to their plans on the Sound Transit.
So
Bridge
beyond
lengths.
width, what about like the heaviness of the trains and all of that? I assume you would develop toward there would be a requirement that it could support any light rail that might go there in the future.
The outside of our roadway, we open up the creek, and it's an open channel. So we have no bridge where they will be putting the Sound Transit trains on. So if they put a bridge there, they're going to have to design it to their train.
So
We're trying to open the stream up as much as we possibly can. And instead of like on Lewis, one creek, it's actually 4 culverts instead of 1 culvert.
got it. So what I'm seeing on the image is actually the gap in between the lanes isn't an area that is bridged, and if light rail was going to go in there, they would have to build their own bridge to accommodate.
Yep. And they have to deal
Okay.
with the thing going over a creek and everything else that they
Yeah.
have to deal with.
Okay,
So we should be minimizing, like I said, minimal, if any, to Sound Transit.
yeah, because you're designing toward what the roadway size is at this point, so. Okay,
Okay.
any other questions? Nope, I think we can move on.
Okay. The SR 900 Tribbets crossing south of the city is straightforward. Although it's outside the city limits, we wanted to make sure you're aware of it. This is one crossing with only minor alignment and elevation changes. This fish passage barrier will replace with either a bridge or a culvert. There will be some lane shifting and a limited full closure. There will be a detour during the full closure. The work should take between 3 months and a year to complete. At this time, we can pause questions on this area.
Councilmember Mertz.
How large will the detour be in this case?
What now? I'm sorry.
How large will the detour be in this case?
For that one, substantial, because there's not a whole lot that goes through that area. We will have to look at, we're working on detour plans as we speak. I got a meeting 2 days to talk about them. And this is one of them that is a tough one, because there's only so many ways, there's only, 4 ways to get across that little ridge of mountains. And this is one of, there's no side way around it. That's why we are pushing for a lot of a box culvert type situation that we can do one weekend and get most of it in there and get out of there, and we're not in there. So extended closure for a weekend, one weekend. We're not talking months or anything for a closure. We're talking quick, get in there and get out of there because of that. And so that's why there'll be some lane shifting to prep up for the work to do the culvert replacement.
Because this is a state highway, is there a limit to how far you can detour?
Not that I know of. Usually we just have to deal with what we can. If there a city street, we can get in agreements with city streets around there, but there isn't anything in this area for that. So we're pretty much looking at either getting them off of 405 or send them down French Street, which is pretty busy road already. I was on the planning on that one too.
All right, thank you.
To follow up on that question, Front Street doesn't allow for trucks. And so would any detour account for that? If you're detouring, if you decide to detour traffic to Front Street and we have no trucks allowed, would they be required to detour a different direction?
We have done split detours where trucks have to go one and one has to, and some have to go another. And then we rely heavily on Chris's PIO group for trying to get that information out there. But yeah, that we've done it and we've had to do it.
I'm not seeing any other questions there, so I think we can move on.
Okay, I'd like to introduce Chris Ocean. She'll talk about the significant impacts, traffic impacts in the Puget Sound area and the ongoing PIO work on the project. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we have noticed when we've tried to do split detours in the past that truckers tend not to follow that, so it's best to just do one. So, yes, as Tim said, I'm going to talk about major Puget Sound construction. So the construction work that we have talked about here tonight is just a few of the projects that we have coming into the Puget Sound area over the next several years, all around the Puget Sound region. Along the I-90 corridor alone, we have, of course, the I-90 SR18 interchange improvement project with heavy construction ramping up on that later this year and completion planned for late 2024. There is a fish passage project on I-90 just east of the I-405 interchange at Sunset Creek that will also have long-term lane reductions on I-90 and shifts in both directions of I-90, very similar to what Tim talked about for some of the lane reductions we're expecting on these fish passage projects. And that project is also combined with 4 other fish passage locations with completion expected in 2026. In the summer of 2024 and 2025, we'll have work on another fish passage replacement project on I-90 at Soderman Creek near Preston. And we also have a lot of preservation work planned all around the Puget Sound area. In summer 2023, we're going to be replacing select concrete panels on I-90, about a 1-mile section east of Issaquah. And this work also includes repairs of 2 bridges along the East Fork Issaquah Creek between Preston and Highlands Drive Northeast. And as early as 2025, we could see work begin on widening SR18 between Issaquah Hobart Road and Deep Creek pending legislative direction. Quite honestly, there is no way to avoid the travel disruptions that we're going to experience over the next 3 years. I mean, it's going to significantly affect people's ability to get around. So WSDOT Communications does plan on an extensive outreach campaign to encourage roadway users to remain engaged and ensure they know about road work, closures, increased congestion, not only for this project that we've talked about tonight, but for all of the work all around Puget Sound that's going to occur over the next several years. But for this fish passage replacement work that will affect the people in this community, we plan to brief essential services, including school districts, transit, chambers of commerce, emergency response agencies, and others. They'll receive updates throughout the course of this work, and the project web pages for it are under construction right now and should hopefully be published by the end of this week. WSDOT is going to use every tool in its toolbox over the next 3 years. Social media, traditional media, news releases, travel advisories, regular briefings with traffic reporters, and news conferences. We have a weekly email letter that we send out. We are planning on an online open house this spring specifically for these projects around Issaquah. And we'll have ongoing virtual and in-person community engagement opportunities before and during construction. Coordination and sharing information and communications materials with the City of Issaquah staff will promote maximum community engagement and information and knowledge about the work that is occurring. And of course, the City Council, you will receive ongoing briefings at major touch points or milestones. Also, the selected design builder is expected to engage with the affected communities. This includes advance notice on the highways, alerting travelers to lane shifts and closures. They will be required to hire a communications specialist dedicated to this project to make sure that communities and neighborhoods know about project specifics, answering questions, and making sure people of Issaquah know what's happening where and when. And now at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Matt.
Before we go into the
Sure.
city, we've got a question, Councilmember DiMichele.
Thanks. I sent this question to Matt earlier, so when I read this, it was like, oh my gosh. And in addition to all the things that you're talking about here, we have World Cup coming in 2026, and I understand we're going to get a PGA tournament up in Sammamish, and construction season is tourist season, and all of those good things. So you mentioned that working with transit, and I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about that, and then how do we encourage the people in our community and also all the communities along I-90 to take advantage of transit and ride shares and van pools and bicycling and all the things that you can do to get cars off the road, because all of this on top of one, happening all at the same time is going to be quite a challenge, I'm sure.
It is going to be a huge challenge. And yes, we are aware of the 2026 World Cup, and I think it's the KPMG Women's PGA Classic or Championship I think you're talking about. Plus we have the Boeing Classic, of course. Those have all been added to our request for proposal. The tricky part about encouraging people to take transit right now is that transit agencies are also suffering from a lack of drivers because of the need for drivers who have CDLs. So everybody's kind of dealing with right now with that, not having enough drivers with CDLs. So it's going to take a concerted effort with the city staff, with all the cities, honestly, all around the Puget Sound area. This is going to be disruptive. There is just no way around it. It's going to be disruptive at pretty much every major interstate, no matter where you go in the region. So while we can encourage people to use transit, to use bicycles, ride, we can do all of those things, but we really need people to stay engaged and change their behavior. And it is going to be a group effort. So as we move forward with all of our planning, we're going to be working with staff from all the various cities that are affected, because it's not just Issaquah. I know that's your prime concern, but we're not directing this at your city by any means. It's everybody. To find the best ways to engage with the citizens of those areas. And it's an ongoing and ever developing an evolving plan that we're working on.
Okay, and it looks like we've also got a question from Deputy Council President Hall.
Thank you. I forgot to ask this earlier, that, are we envisioning selecting one design builder for the whole slew of projects or several?
It should be just a single design builder.
Okay.
When does the RFP go out?
When does the RFP? The RFP goes out in September. The RFQ ad date is actually going to be in May, but we're looking more in September, November for the RFP submittal to the proposers that meet the RFQ requirements.
Okay, now we can go on to the city.
Thank you. Okay. As Tim and Chris mentioned, staff are in the process of engaging with WSDOT. Currently, there's a team involved in this engagement effort that spans across multiple departments. This is being led by Public Works staff. And one element we are engaging on is coordination on city projects. The work will impact timing and design considerations of TR 28, Northwest Sammamish Road Non-Motorized Improvement Project. WSDOT will be raising the roadway, and we will be widening the roadway. So there's quite a bit of engagement and elements that we need to discuss. These elements will be brought before the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee on March 14th. Work will impact park facilities, and park staff are currently coordinating with WSDOT on impacts to Sammamish Cove Park, as well as other trailhead and pedestrian connectors that will be impacted by the work. Staff are working with Cascade Water Alliance, as the work will impact the Bellevue-Issaquah pipeline at 2 locations along Newport Way. In collaboration with WSDOT, we are evaluating closures and detour implications and determining allowable closures to city streets to install specific items. Work will have major impacts not only to known infrastructure, but added traffic to city streets as detours are put into place and lane reductions occur on the freeway. WSDOT's work will also generate new CIP projects that the city will need to incorporate on in the next round of CIP development, including revising sediment ponds along Newport Way that connect to West Village Park Creek and relocating 1,400 feet of gravity sewer, a line that is currently located in WSDOT limited access right-of-way along Newport Way. Future council engagement points. In your packet tonight, staff have highlighted some future engagement opportunities where we will bring specific elements related to WSDOT's work to the council in the coming future. These include, on February 21st, we will be discussing franchise agreements for city infrastructure in WSDOT right-of-way. These are for existing facilities in WSDOT right-of-way for which a franchise agreement has either expired or never been filed, and that will be impacted by WSDOT's work. Again, like I mentioned earlier, on March 14th, we'll be going to the Mobility and Infrastructure to talk about Northwest Sammamish Road, to talk about a preferred cross-section for that project. We will also talk about WSDOT's impacts to that project with the Schneider Creek crossing. In the second quarter of 2023, we'll go back to M&I. Staff will provide recommendations and provide council the opportunity to provide input on city street closures and detours. In the second or third quarter of 2023, we'll be discussing turnback agreements at Lewis Creek. And that was the first location we talked about with the roundabout and the bridge, and where WSDOT access is and where the city's right-of-way begins. This will be a larger discussion with Issaquah and Bellevue as the project straddles the border between the two cities, and ownership of certain right-of-way will revise the maintenance and operations needs in the future. In the second quarter of 2024, we'll provide written information to the council on the update of the culvert replacement schedule that will be provided by the design builder. With the support of the design builder, we will also provide periodic project updates from 2024 through 2029 for each specific project. And other possible council touchpoints will include discussions regarding policy questions, contractual obligations, future maintenance responsibilities, and specific updates for each project. One of the main elements that staff are working with WSDOT on is development of a community engagement plan. Community engagement will be primarily the responsibility of WSDOT and their contractor. However, staff are looking into ways to support their efforts and ensure an engagement plan that fits the needs of our community is entered into the WSDOT contract with their design builder. In 2023, WSDOT will hold its initial online open house, as Chris mentioned. Staff will be engaged in this virtual presentation to communicate impacts to city streets and neighborhoods and messaging that will be provided through city resources, such as our website and notifications. The city webpage will support the WSDOT webpage with pertinent information specific to Issaquah residents. A more robust engagement plan will be refined once WSDOT has secured a design-build contractor for the work and a schedule is developed for the multiple impacts to city streets. In 2024, in the spring of 2024, specific neighborhood engagement will be developed with the design builder. This will be catered to the neighborhoods that will be impacted, such as when a defined schedule and details evolve at the Newport Way roadway, a Newport meeting will be developed. Similar meetings will occur on Northwest Sammamish Road and West Lake Sammamish Parkway. We are still strategizing opportunities to engage on impacts to SR 900 and Gilman, as these impacts are not neighborhood specific and will impact a larger portion of our community. The city will support WSDOT in their mailers, as well as social media engagement. And this leads to direction needed tonight. With the understanding that a full engagement plan hasn't fully been developed, are there additional messaging strategies or engagement opportunities that council feels the community would benefit from? And we would also like council's input on city council touchpoints throughout the project. Are there more touchpoints that you would like to see, or other strategies that we should employ? And with that, leave it up for questions. Oh, wrong direction.
Okay, I'm wondering if we have any questions before we go to public comment and then any deliberation comments. You have a question? Okay, Deputy Council President Hall, followed by Councilmember Marks.
Thank you. I just had two more questions that I thought of. First is for city staff. So are we anticipating, this might be something, if this is going to come before the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee, feel free to just cut me off. Or, but are we anticipating needing to prioritize any capital projects before the next biennial budget? Like not just in this CIP that we're working on now, but kind of in the mid-biennial process this year to get ready for some of this? Like you talked about sewer impacts. Is there anything that we can be doing earlier rather than later to kind of prevent service disruption?
That's a good question. The good news is that the CIP development is right in line with their award for their contractor. So they'll get going probably at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. So we might have a little bit of design work in 2024, but any construction work we can plan for in our CIP development this year as we develop the next CIP round.
Okay, so we should definitely expect that conversation to be part of CIP development. Got it.
Absolutely.
Next question's for WSDOT. So the virtual WSDOT open houses, are those typically successfully implemented in terms of attendance? Or do you generally get a lot of people coming to those?
So we can do a couple different things for our WSDOT open houses. Generally, our open houses, they're hosted on a platform called engagewsdot.wa.gov. And so we have, and they're usually up for a month or longer in place. So it's not just a one and, they stay up, and then we encourage participation to people to leave comments, to fill out surveys, just to provide information. And then we send out various, to advertise them, we do news releases, travel advisories. We put it in our weekly news email letters to continue to get that engagement. So it really kind of depends on the project and what the online open house is. Corridor studies, sometimes, but a fish passage project like this, I expect it to get really good engagement with probably thousands of visits.
Councilmember Marks, followed by Councilmember Hunt.
So earlier it was said things we can't do dictate schedule. Do we have any ability to influence the schedule?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it again.
Do we have any ability to influence the schedule?
We have looked at things like we are active member of the Kokanee Alliance group. And after their last presentation, they asked if we could get it, well, they wanted it done by 2025, but with 2 to 3 years, we are going to be forcing the design builder to go and work on that as one of the first ones. So by the end of 2027, we're looking at whether or not we can actually can contractually force them to get that creek up and going by the end of 2027. We are looking into situations like that. But yeah, there is some influence, but that's it like that. In the city as a whole, for the city of Issaquah, as you saw, we had 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 years, and I have to be done between the end of 24 to 29. That's only 5 years, and there's 9 years listed there. So there will be overlapping, and you should be expecting that we will be for the full 5 years working in the city of Issaquah someplace on one of those 3 sites.
Yeah, I get that. I have a particular concern. So many of these are primary arterials that don't have easy alternate routes, and to have so many of these potentially occurring simultaneously, I've got a real concern around emergency services and level of service for fire and IPD. And are we going to be able to sequence this such that we can make sure we can maintain minimums for public safety when these are occurring, so that our police and fire can get to the parts of the city they have to in a timely fashion?
We do talk to these services even before the RFP. It was said in one of our slides. And we do, one of the requirements in our RFP is that anything that changes or whatever happens, the design builder has to communicate with these essential services and has to tell them what's going on and what's going on. We are going to be putting a lot of requirements. The closers, as mentioned, no 2 closers that are going to impact each other are going to be allowed at the same time. We want to be good neighbors. And so we want to make sure that we don't have people running into one closer, into another closer, and get into a little circle. We want to make sure that it's easy, it looks good, it makes us look good, it makes you guys look good. We have to do the work, but we need to make sure that they understand what's going on. So we have a very aggressive construction requirements on closers and detours.
Yeah, we do have the city does have some ability to provide some conditions in the RFP in terms of where a detour would be located. And we are discussing with WSDOT closure lengths, and that'll be part of our next phase of our discussions as we deliberate how long along Newport Way, say, a bridge. We can't dictate that it can be done in a week, because that's impossible. But we have the ability to say, a closure can't last indefinitely on a period of roadway. So we have some wiggle room, or at least some ability to discuss with WSDOT.
I guess what I'm hoping for is I'm hoping the city has standards that are going to be required to be met for emergency services during these times.
Yes. In the amount that we can, yes. There will be conditions put into place in the RFP that we can put in there. But a closure, we can't obviously accommodate emergency vehicles through, but we'll be discussing that part.
But there has to be a plan. I don't want to know that there's a discussion that's going to occur. I want to know that there's standards that are going to be maintained during this, such that our citizens are going to achieve minimum public safety standards. I don't want to hear that there's going to be conversations. I want to know that our citizens are going to be safe during these operations.
And
City
Councilmember Marks,
Administrator?
let me jump in. We'll work very carefully. As I think you've heard tonight, this is going to be a multi-year issue for us, and we'll work with Eastside Fire and Rescue and Issaquah Police to make sure that those standards, and as we brief you, we will bring the chiefs at some appropriate point to share what those standards are.
Thank you. That would help.
Okay. Councilmember Joe.
Thank you. I often look at your Twitter when I'm traveling from Seattle or Everett trying to get back home in the evenings. I see that you have a past Twitter, you have a north and a south Twitter, and some other specific areas. are there plans to perhaps have a Fish Passage Twitter, or at least an East Side traffic Twitter during this time of intensive construction? It would help us, I think, as we're traveling back and forth, if we can look and see that Northwest, Newport Way is going to be closed, that we know there are 2 other fish passages we have to get home in our migration. So if you can comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
I will talk with our social media manager about that. The difficulty we have is that we have hundreds and hundreds of fish passages all around the state. So if we do fish passage, Twitter, something like that, it could be referenced, you'd have to potentially wade through a lot of them. Privately, Olympic Peninsula has so many that we're actually calling it Fishnado.
Of course. Well, I'm just coming up with a name off the top of my head right here as we speak, but if you can find something that's specific so that we will know, the category we're looking for, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I will pass that along to our social media manager for the state, and we're also hiring one specifically for the Northwest region. So that individual might also have some ideas on how we can take our social media engagement and Twitter, TikTok, all of that stuff to push it to that next level of engagement and what we need to do for the next 3 years. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm tentatively going to say I'm not seeing any other questions. So we have an opportunity for public comment on this item. So anyone who is indicating a desire to speak, if you are on the phone, you can press *3. If you joined by computer or smartphone, you can look for your hand icon and indicate a desire to speak on this topic. Anybody in the room? Okay, fantastic. David, if you would go ahead and press the button.
There we
Thank
go. David Kapler, 255 Southeast Andrews Street. The amount of city staffing that's going to need to be increased to make this whole thing work is a concern to me. Trying to bid on something that's going to go into 2029 in areas where you have no idea what's going to be there. Just thinking last week, you approved a lot of cost overruns of mystery pipes that have showed up in the city streets, and what we're going to be seeing on this project out there, unanticipated things. And then trying to bid on something, a company bidding on work they're going to do in 2029. What's the price of gravel, pipe, asphalt, and so it's just going to be a huge amount of money and a huge amount of potential risk for a company that gets into this and for the jurisdictions that are engaging in it, and we are certainly be engaging. Then there's the long-term maintenance, which would be good. But park and public works people, hopefully there's going to be a lot of new plantings and those kinds of things. There'll be some kind of requirement that those be managed over a certain time, but a lot of this is going to be on city property, so we will be picking up some of those areas. There's a whole bunch of stuff here that I was glad to hear some of the stuff going on east of the city, which is, I think, a lot more simpler, and I think benefit-wise, dollar benefit-wise, would be because it's simpler and more efficient and not bridges and so much and all that. Those things could be certainly beneficial. So you got your work cut out. They have their work cut out, and good luck. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Do we have anybody indicating a desire to speak online?
No.
Okay. So at this point, I know we've asked questions. Anybody have any comments they'd like to share? Councilmember DiMichele?
Thanks. I think it's important, first of all, to say that these are wonderful projects. When I was working at King County, I had I worked on several culvert replacement projects. And it is wonderful to see the replacement culvert and see the water coming through and the fish coming up. And so I just want us to have that in our mind, because the rest of it's not so much fun. But really, when this is done, this is going to be fabulous and tremendous improvement to what's there currently. I have two areas of concern, and one you've already heard, and that's the transportation piece and the focus on trying to change behavior, as Chris said. And that's not an easy thing to do. We'll hope that the frustration level doesn't get to such a point that people change behaviors in adverse ways. So I would like to see us, in terms of the community outreach, to be, and I really appreciate the larger plan that you're talking about, but here locally, I would really like us to target our business community and see if we can't emphasize the ride share and the van share possibilities, because Chris is absolutely right. I was at Eastside Transportation Partnership last week, and Metro is still struggling to find drivers, and they are still struggling with the financial impacts of the pandemic. And so that may not be the option we would like it to be, especially in the Far East King County areas. But our major employers could adopt much more aggressive approaches to van pools and ride shares and those kinds of things, and cut down on the traffic as much as possible, because it's going to be kind of torturous to get. And also, you may not be aware, but the majority of people come into Issaquah to work and go out. So that commuting piece is really important to our community. My other big concern is the adverse impact on our business and tourist parts of our community. And again, I think a very targeted approach to that part of community outreach, if we could talk and work with our business community, find out what they need. Again, as I said earlier, construction time is tourist time, and that summertime is really important to our restaurants. They will not want to see really big impact to their business and traffic to their businesses during that time. So whatever we can do to mitigate the impacts of these major construction projects on their businesses, I think we should do the best that we can to make sure that our business community stays robust and viable during the big construction periods during the summer. So those are my two concerns. Amazingly huge project. As David said, you've got your work cut out for you, and I'm really glad that you came to see us this far before the project actually begins. I appreciate that, and hope that we'll continue to have this dialogue. So thank you very much.
Councilmember Hunt, go ahead.
Thanks. Similar to Councilmember DeMichelle, I wanted to make sure that the messaging, there's a lot of important messaging about where there's going to be closures and how to get around, and I think that would be great to be really specific for Issaquah so people don't have to comb through lots of other tweets to get that info. But I also wanted to make sure that we aren't losing the main point of why we're doing this, because we in Issaquah are a community that really does value salmon. We have salmon days, we have the fish hatchery, and so working with our community partners that could help with the messaging around why we're doing this, to improve habitat access, that this is important for jobs and that this is important for our stewardship of our very important salmon, also important for orcas. Just all of that messaging around why we're doing it, I think could take the edge off a little bit of the frustration for this community that does love salmon. So I just wanted to say that, and appreciate the conversation about the other impacts on public safety and transportation, which I'm sure we'll have to continue working through. But that would be my comments, is to reach out with our partners around Friends of the Issaquah Salmon Hatchery, Friends of Lake Sammamish, potentially Salmon Recovery Council of our watershed, which is WIRA 8. Sounds like you working with the Kokanee group, all of those groups.
Yeah, if I could just comment, we do have a robust fish passage program and have developed a lot of relationships with those various groups. And we already have some great examples that we can show people, saying, this is what you get this is what happens when we do it. We have video of literally, sometimes within a day of opening up a fish passage, you start seeing fish coming through. And within a year, it's to the point where it's like, you could almost walk across the top of them. There's so many of them in there. It's really remarkable to see. So those are those great, proof of performance, if you will. It says, this is why we're doing this, and these are the benefits. So
Yes,
we'll
yeah.
definitely use that and keep that in mind.
Okay, absolutely. And I think on our side, for a future conversation, it'll also be great to talk about the habitat improvements, habitat access, and how does this impact our plans in those area, plantings and other, because this is all about habitat access, and so the city, potentially may have to adjust our plans for habitat improvements. I think that's a different conversation, but thank you.
Councilmember Mertz.
Thank you. I'm very much in favor of this work being done. I'm excited that it's going to be done. It's important that all of our salmonic streams, the fish have a chance to use them. I continue to be concerned around sequencing. In engineering, the old truism is schedule, budget, performance, pick two of the three. And I know budget's constrained, and when I hear getting done by 2029, what I'm worried about is that we're going to hold schedule and budget, and what will be hit will be performance in terms of the impact in the community. If I could wave a magic wand, I would hold a performance standard in place and then build a schedule around maintaining that performance standard. So as we move forward, I'm going to be really looking to see that we're confident that we're not going to impact public safety. It's going to impact traffic. I hope we understand that. I hope we come up with systems in place. But, that will happen. But it can't impact public safety. It just can't. So that's the part that I'm going to be having an eye on as we move forward here. So I'm hoping that we have some baseline standards that we're going to use to evaluate the sequencing such that we can be confident that it won't have an impact on public safety. Thank you.
Our Secretary of Transportation, we just had a meeting not too long ago, and the number one word was safety. So, no, safety is the number one on our goal. Safety of the traveling public, safety of the contractors, safety of our employees. It's all number one and for the neighborhoods around there. So safety is always number one. Time schedule, unfortunately, on this one is, this project is, we have to have our fish passage done by March of 2030. That's the injunction. So that's why we are pushing as long as we can on this with the end of 2029. So schedule is a criteria on this one. Budget, not as much as, like you said, the three. Budget is the less of the criteria than what schedule and safety. So.
Thank you.
No problem.
Well, Deputy Council President Hall?
Thank you. I guess the other part of this was too, what kind of council touches are important. It seems like what was described in the memo is a emphasis on presentations and discussions at the Mobility and Infrastructure Committee. So I just wanted to make sure to say on camera, it'll be important for our chair, Councilmember Ray, to be summarizing what we're talking about at these meetings during our regional and committee reports, so the council's up to date. So Councilmember DiMichele and I will make sure to bug him about that. And then also ditto everything that was said. I'm in complete agreement, and also thank you very much for doing all this important work and also making the trip out to Issaquah during this storm.
Yeah.
Well, I will echo a lot of what you've heard. A great conversation. We obviously care very much about our community and the impacts and all of that. So it's really nice to hear the planning that's going into it, and nice to hear from the city staff that we're thinking about our CIP projects and all of that. I will echo a little bit. We're a very fishy town, and the more that you can use that in humor and appreciation and just very much the spirit of us, I think the more goodwill you may earn in that communication. So I will just add that out there. But we look forward to hearing more at each of those touch points. And if there's nothing else, I'll just ask, do you guys have what you need as far as feedback from us? Seeing.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming out here. talking to us and everything. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So looking back at my agenda, at this point, we've got one more item on our agenda. That is ID 1398, the Capital Improvement Plan Goals, Outcomes, and Project Selection Criteria, presented by Andrea Snyder, the Deputy City Administrator. Andrea, I see you getting set up over there.
I am. Thank you very much, Council President Walsh. Just 1 second here. So I'm the Deputy City Administrator, Andrea Snyder. Also with me here tonight is our Chief Financial Officer to help present on this item and answer any questions that you have, Robert Hamoud. So we will be calling him up a little bit later. So I have a very minimal presentation for you tonight because largely tonight is about following up with you on the discussions from the council retreat on January 28th of this year. So at that retreat, we discussed really two things pertinent to our next CIP, or Capital Improvement Plan. The first is the goals and outcomes chart. Council had stated that you wanted to establish some goals and outcomes for this CIP update that we're undertaking this year. So at that retreat, you had brainstormed some goals and some outcomes that you would like to see through the CIP update process. We've taken those, that brainstorm of yours, we've consolidated it into kind of 5 main goals. The goal and outcomes table is in your packet. I also have it shared up here on the screen. And also, you had asked for some umbrella goals, very similar to the Title 18 Land Use Code update process. So we took that feedback and consolidated it all on this chart, as you see here. So there's 5 goals that we have here. Projects have a clear path to inclusion in the CIP. The CIP process and priorities are communicated clearly with City Council and the community. Projects have accountable path toward execution and/or completion. Equity is inherent in project selection and delivery, and that we've clearly defined our funding strategies. So with those 5 goals, and you also provided some input into the background, into the desired outcomes, the administration has filled in some of these other columns with issues, objectives, and possible actions based off of the discussions that were had at the retreat, and also just how we think we can put some of those goals into action and achieve those outcomes. So the first question for you tonight is, does this reflect the general discussion at the retreat, and do you have any suggested changes for the goals and outcomes chart? So that's the first question that we'll be asking. Before we get into that, also wanted to follow up on sorry here, hold on a second. Also wanted to follow up on the criteria. So I only have a small issue because the thing that allows me to share my screen is covering up my next tab. There we go. So here are the criteria we discussed at the council retreat. We heard feedback from you about criteria. These are the criteria that we use to select projects in the CIP. We wanted to update these criteria for this next CIP draft, and we received some feedback to you about these criteria that we would use to select projects. One of the things that we heard from you is a desire to ensure consistency with prior council commitments. And we've reflected that here in long-standing commitment. We've added that as a criteria to this list for consideration. We're really focusing on the bolded statements here, not necessarily the green, yellow, and red. We had discussed those a little bit during the retreat of how we would grade or rank projects according to these criteria, but really looking at making sure that we address the main criteria. So we heard from you that you wanted to have criteria to address a longstanding council commitment, so we have added that. We also heard from you a desire to incorporate some of the Bellevue CIP criteria on financial and economic impacts. And so we have included some of that phrasing in city resource management and economic impact, but we've also addressed some of those concepts in this replacement or capital maintenance of existing infrastructure, and talking about avoiding future costs, et cetera. That was similar to what we found in the Bellevue CIP criteria. And then finally, we understood that there were discussions among council and feedback about identified funding and concerns that if there was no funding for a project, it wouldn't be included in the CIP because of the criteria, to have identified funding for a project. So we tried to address that in the city resource management and economic impact criteria. We've kind of walked back some of that language and modified some of that language from the version you saw on the 28th. But at this point, identified funding is still in the criteria because we have that has been an important part of our process to date. So we look forward to discussions from you on criteria and whether this reflects the discussions that you had on the 28th, if there's changes that you'd like to make to these criteria. Next steps for goals and outcomes and the criteria following this feedback, we actually have a summit of 4 of the city advisory boards this Thursday to further refine the criteria. So we're getting together the Environmental Board, the Equity Board, the Transportation Advisory Board, and the Park Board to take another look at the criteria, further refine them, and we will be using these criteria to evaluate projects, to get into the draft CIP, and then we'll be coming back to council in the council committees in May to look at the draft CIP, see how those criteria are working for the draft CIP, and for further council discussion on the proposed projects within the CIP. And we are hopeful to have adoption of the CIP in June. So those are some of the next council touches. Are there any questions before we get to those discussion questions?
Councilmember Joe?
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. It was great. I think you captured most of the items that we had discussed during our retreat. I had a question about the replacement or capital maintenance of existing infrastructure item on there. And oftentimes, I've noticed that sometimes we'll defer maintenance or we'll defer a project and think that we're saving money because we're not spending it in year 1. But in essence, we're by not spending it to do the maintenance or to do the upkeep, we end up spending more in year 2 or 3 because it fails or because we have an emergency because it fails. Is that the type of thought and reasoning that was going into that? If you could expand on that a little bit more, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, exactly. So there's a couple of ways that we can look at this when we think about maintenance. As it says here, does the project remedy a substandard asset condition? Does it extend or reset the asset's useful life? Does it protect or enhance the level of service to the community? Or does it help avoid a future cost? And that helping avoid a future cost portion really gets to the point that you were making, Councilmember Joe, of is it going to be more expensive to maintain and replace this asset in the future? Can we help avoid those costs by addressing the issues now or extending its useful life now? So that's exactly what that's trying to get to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that oftentimes cities or organizations don't put enough thought into the necessity of spending on maintenance, and I hope the city is giving some good thought to that. I think we're looking at the paver project or the cement replacement project is one of those items that we're dedicating to maintenance along the way, and I hope we continue to think along that vein to think more long-term with our 2-year biennial budget. Thank you.
Question, Deputy Councilmember Hall?
Thank you very much for doing all this work in such a short amount of time. So the administration's looking for feedback on just kind of the overall, in terms for the criteria of the particular bolded criteria categories, essentially. It might not necessarily be appropriate to comment on the rest of it now until the boards have had their summit. Is that what they're thinking?
Yeah, we're trying to keep the discussion at the level of the bolded criteria or the language defining the bolded criteria. So if you have feedback on that, that would be great.
Councilmember Hunt?
I have a question on the longstanding commitment. It's set at a threshold for 20 2018 and then 2018 to 2022. Is there would this, this would be revised year after year, so is the idea that it would keep moving up? And then the other question is, we have this huge list of items at the end of our CIP, the future projects list, which I think go back before 2018, and I am under the impression that a lot of projects have been on the list since before 2018, and so I'm wondering why 2018, and if there were other considerations, if there were other ways that you thought about doing this that might be more specific, more, narrow it down a little bit.
Sure. Thank you for that question, because we have talked about this item quite a bit, and I'm wondering if Robert can speak to this more detailed than I can.
Can everybody hear me okay? Thank you. Councilmember Hunt, part of this is taking for lack of a better term, a normal year. I mean, if we went back 2 years, obviously we'd be in the height still of COVID. So going back to 2018 and identifying projects that the city has never addressed. And kind of back to Councilmember Joe's point, some of that does fall under the deferred maintenance category. If you look at categories such as the concrete program, even pavement management program. So those are the items that we want to make sure, as far as a maintenance perspective, the more you wait, the costlier it gets to replace. So that was part of the reason of bringing those projects back up as far as the older projects. But then also some of the unfunded projects that are still a priority of the city that we have still not identified the funding for.
Okay, thank you. I think it would be good to look at that future years list, because I think those were also, they were intended for that far out, and so they've been on the list for a long time, but that's not my intention with the longstanding commitments. The longstanding commitments is more the things that have been surfaced multiple years by the community or by the council. So I think just differentiating, there's probably going to need to be some differentiation there, or a very large percentage of our CIP would fall into this category, and that's sort of by design.
Council President.
Yes, City Administrator.
As the Deputy City Administrator indicated, we've talked a bit about this. And so really, we want to know what you want. 18, I think we looked at the pandemic. It's really kind of less than that. I think you can pick whatever date you like. We also want to be able to have a sense of where the project stood. I mean, if there's a list of projects that was never discussed, but there's a title that's lasted for a long period of time, that's something different than a project that was, in year 6 and then in year 6 and in year 6 of multiple plans. So whatever the council feels comfortable with, I think as Councilmember March had said at the retreat, it's just a recognition that this has been on the community's radar for a while. I don't think there's any real magic from the administration's perspective as to how you slice it. So if something prior to 2018 makes sense, we can go back. I don't think we've actually done any counting at this point yet to see which projects would actually fall into this category, but we want to give you what you want with this.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll open up an opportunity for public comment before we go into any commentary of our own. So I'm wondering if there is anyone not in person, we've got a head shake there, anyone online with a desire to speak?
We still have one member of the public with us online, but I'm not seeing a raised hand.
Okay, so at this point, I'm thinking maybe we take the goals and outcomes chart first and then talk about criteria, or vice versa. But I'll just go ahead and propose goals and outcomes first. So do we have any comments, questions, concerns, detailed thoughts, thumbs up? Okay, I've got 2 thumbs up. Councilmember Hunt.
Thank you. I generally agree. I think it's a good start. A quick question on process. Do you, are you going to get input from the commissions on this as well as the criteria, or just the criteria?
Just the criteria.
Okay. So my thought on this then is that there is some overlap. So for example, equity is inherent in project selection and delivery, and then we also have equity criteria. And it seems to me that it would be great to have a step after you do the work refining the criteria with the commissions to make sure that this goals and outcomes chart is aligned with that. So the goal here about equity is inherent in project selection and delivery has possible actions that are not, in my mind, all that related to the criteria. And so if the equity board comes back with feedback about that, and then, for example, there's language access that's discussed in the goals and outcomes chart that wasn't discussed in the criteria document. So I think just aligning on those would be good. And similarly, I think it'd be great to make sure that we have that it's clear from this goals and outcomes chart that we have these criteria, because unlike the Title 18 process, with Title 18, the goals and outcomes really was how we were evaluating it. For this process, we have both criteria for individual projects, and then we have an overall document. So I just want to make sure that they are working together, and that that they reference each other, and that it's clear how we as a council will ultimately evaluate projects using both documents. My last comment is one of the last umbrella goals is make the CIP document and capital planning easier to understand for use by the public, city council, and staff. I think it's probably just the process needs to be easier to understand it and have meaningful engagement. But the community, unlike the Title 18, I think that's sort of a holdover from the Title 18 goals and outcomes where people will actually use the code. Here, the community is going to be impacted by the projects that come out of the code, but I think that wording needs to be changed a little bit because they're not as likely to, use the document in the same way they would use the code for our land use code. That's my comments. Thanks.
Not seeing any other comments, so I'll just go ahead with some of mine. I don't see anything related to outside plans. I know we had discussed EFR and state parks and kind of other outside entities that might have plans that would coincide with or relate to some of our city projects. So I'd like to make sure that gets referenced somewhere in there. Goal, let's see. Issue 2A, so under the specific goal, the CIP process and priorities are communicated clearly with City Council and the community. The issue 2A, it's unclear how projects from other planning documents are incorporated into the CIP. Doesn't seem to me that makes sense in that goal. It seems like it makes sense more in number 1, just from my perspective. That's all about how do you get a project in and what's the path to inclusion. And then missing under, so there was an issue we had kind of talked about funding that I'm not sure is getting hit here. The goal number 5 seems to really focus on having a funding strategy. And I think one of our big problems was, hey, if something didn't have funding, it was kind of eliminated. And so being able to talk through that as either an issue or an objective, that basically funding no longer excludes a project from consideration and is one of the criteria, not the only one, was one of the big issues I was identifying with the CIP, and I just want to make sure that that is referenced in there. And so those were my comments on the goals and outcomes. I will give everybody another look. Looks like we're good. Criteria. So if you'll go ahead and bring the criteria document up, and so you're just looking for general feedback, thoughts, questions, concerns on that top level, not going into the green, yellow, and red. And Councilmember DiMichele.
Thank you. So, can you hear me okay? Okay. I will let you know, first of all, great job, fantastic job as always, but I really, really had to struggle with the equity piece. And I just will stay on the top level, but so much of equity it does not have to do with how many people are affected. It could be, one person. I'm just feeling as though this is just off the beam. Does the project benefit all or most of the community members? It doesn't talk about harm. And when we went through the training with Benita, she talked about who does this benefit, who does this harm? And so much of equity is about who got harmed. And the other piece is the historic part of it. And I'm thinking, my example that I came up with is the Native American population. Relatively small percentage of people in our community are Native American, but the historic harm that's been done to that particular group really needs to be taken into consideration along, perhaps more than their numbers. We have to deal with the history. Same thing with our African American community. And then, I almost got to the point where I wondered if there's a moral aspect to equity that is not measurable by the things that we've got in front of us. And so I almost wondered, I think it should be part of the criteria, but, so I'm just throwing this out. This is just me thinking, does it even fit into the green, yellow, and red criteria, into that format? Because we're talking about something that can't be measured by numbers alone. It has to be within the context of what has happened to a particular subgroup in the history of our country, in the history of our community. And again, who does it benefit? Who does it harm? I think all those questions have to be included in that criteria, or we're not really giving that a full measure of understanding. So, the solution I came up with was the equity board needs to think about this. So I'm quite happy to turn it over to them. But those were the questions that went through my mind. I just really have been thinking about this all day long. This may be beyond, these issues may be beyond the criteria that we use to figure out where projects belong on our list. So, my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead and turn yourself off. And Deputy Council President Hall.
It sounds like we were kind of in a mind meld earlier today, because I was thinking about this too, and it's really difficult because, and that's what my solution was, that the equity board needs to think about this too, right? It's because I'm thinking about whether a project benefits everyone or most of the population is not what equity is, right? Equity is about investment in underserved communities, right? And trying to lift people up. So I think there is probably a way to incorporate the red, green, and yellow into here, but this one needs to be adjusted. I have thoughts on the red, green, and yellow, but I will save them until it comes back to us and see what the equity board and the other boards think about this. But I do think the second part of the description of the equity one, does it improve equitable access, is the right question to ask, not necessarily that first one, because it's really more about that focus on underserved communities, whether they've been underserved, a particular community or neighborhood or et cetera in Issaquah has been underserved, or historically marginalized or underserved communities too. So there's kind of two parts to that really need to be grappled with, right? So,
Councilmember Hall, I was just going to make a comment on, because we've heard, equity is a very important part, of course, of the city's planning, of the city council as well. So when we came up with all the criteria in here, the overall themes and the red, yellow, green, we're trying to also think about an equity lens. That's one of the themes, sustainability being another one, that we're thinking about each project. Where is it going? Where are our projects going when you're talking about PMP or even our maintenance projects? where are neighborhoods that have been maybe underserved. So that's actually part of, we're trying to have it as a piece of our whole process, if that makes sense, kind of an overall guiding. How it fits in there, that's a good question, and we'll look forward to hearing from the Equity Board as well on Thursday.
City Administrator?
Yes, thank you, Council President. This is going to be a very iterative process, and I think that we recognize, as we have gone through this, that this measure is not an easy one to pick and to define, and to ask the Equity Board to take one or two passes at this is not a very fair request of the Equity Board, and we would like to continue to move forward with the process. So I think what we'll do is we'll continue at this. We'll make, I think, lots of great comments from the council this evening. We'll make some of these adjustments. We'll talk more with the Equity Board as well as the other boards and commissions. But this will be a continuing process. The reality is not all of our capital projects fall in to some of these weightier questions. Some of them are a little bit more straightforward, don't have a lot of direct impact to any community members if it's an infrastructure project. And I think, but there are definitely those that do. And so I think as we go through this process, we'll be able to identify perhaps those that require more additional examination and thought. If we need to double back with the Equity Board through this, we certainly can. As the process continues, there'll be touches here at the council, at council committees. So it's not a one look and be done. I think as Andrea has been preparing for the meetings on Thursday, we want to make sure that all the boards and commissions realize this is not just a one and done request, that this is going to be an ongoing discussion over multiple years. But again, we also don't want to wait until it's perfect and not apply any of these measures. So we hear the council, we appreciate the difficulty here, and know that as we reach out to the community, reach out to our boards and commissions, we're going to be very honest and straightforward with them as well, so that they don't believe that we're asking them to make some sort of snap judgment. Here's two sentences, like it or not. That's because that's not appropriate at all. So we'll continue this process, and I think as we come back to the boards, from the boards and commissions to the council committees, I think this will be a little bit easier than to start getting our hands around the specific projects that need additional scrutiny.
Okay. Councilmember Hunt, are you looking to make a comment?
Also looking forward to hearing what the Equity Board thinks about criteria. I noted from Councilmember DeMichelle's comments that the climate resiliency and environmental benefit, those ones are really about, the first one is really to prevent detrimental impact so that one is really the don't make things worse. And then there's the project reduces detrimental impact or provides a benefit but not necessary to prevent an anticipated detrimental impact, and then project has no impact on the environment. So that could be something for them to consider too, is a similar sort of don't have additional detrimental impacts on affected communities under the equity one. That was just a follow-up comment to those comments you made earlier. On the long-standing commitment, I think the issue I have is that I think we will find with these current criteria that there is this long list of projects. I just checked, the long list of projects in the back of the CIP, those are expected to not begin until about 6 years out anyway. And so if we have, and that's not necessarily what we meant by longstanding commitment, those are just planned for additional years in the future. So I think for that one, we will have to live with it, I think, but it is really meant to be more those projects that we have prioritized for, that many years. But like we've prioritized it since 2018 would make more sense to me, and I think narrow down the list a lot.
City Administrator.
So Councilmember Hunt, is there a better date?
Well, I think the first thing would be that longstanding projects list, not everything in that is a longstanding commitment. I think some of those have been expected to take place after, due to sequencing, those are expected to take place after. So that's not that it's been a long commitment and been on the community's mind for many years. It's potentially that it has, is planned for that many years out and is on track. So I think it would be that it is either in the plan and has the timeline has moved out multiple years, like we've been telescoping the timeline on that project for multiple years, or it has been surfaced by the council for that many years if it is not in the existing plans and the timeline is moving further out. So I guess those would be my two
So if I make,
suggestions.
Council President, Councilmember Hunt, that becomes more subjective, and that's perfectly fine. And if it's just a matter of we bring a list to the council and the council says, here's the ones we consider longstanding, and we tick a box, that may be better. So it's ultimately your decision, regardless of criteria. You'll know it when you see it, so to speak. And I think we'd be perfectly comfortable to figure out a way to bring a list to you and simply have you say, okay, here are the 7 that we consider longstanding commitments, by whatever definition you all think is appropriate, assuming it's not every project, which I don't think that's the intent of anyone on the dais. But if there are those that you have identified, perhaps we just have a way for you to do that at some future meeting in the not too distant future and go from there.
I think that sounds good. I think it is an iterative process, but I think that would probably narrow down the list, which is the intent of these criteria, better than what we have here.
So we'll work on that and sort through the best way to do that with you, and again, the not too distant future.
So I'll add my comments on that area. I feel like the longstanding commitment is just a subsection of the earlier one on community priority. So the community priority, as it is talked about here, is specifically about, is the project identified in a planning document, or is the project required to support a priority identified in a city planning document? But I think by the fact that it's called community priority, longstanding commitment really is the idea. So that would be, I think, my preference, rather than necessarily giving that extra weight. And I might identify the concepts as, you know, it was a project in a CIP that has been deferred multiple times, or with this concept of a list that we or a board come to. So that's my thought process. I don't know if anybody else is getting that, or if it feels like it should stay as a separate idea. Councilmember Martz.
I personally feel that whenever possible, explicitly calling out where we've made commitments and, reinforcing those commitments that we've made previously, having that have its own swim lane is valuable in the community, seeing a continuity in our thought processes. So I understand your point. In some ways, it might feel, and it might even look a little bit like double dipping and having two separate categories that are really have a related function. But I think so often when you see in the community people's attitudes towards leadership in the community, I think there's real value in saying, look, we said we were going to do this thing, and we're going to do this thing. So that's my thought.
I have other comments, but I'm going to look down, see if anybody. Okay, so my next one was really on cost savings and the economics. So you've got this criteria around city resource management and economic impact, and I feel like those may be too, like, I think the resource management and the limitations are an important thing, but another factor there is, if we have 2 projects that could be co-located and co-worked on, and that would result in cost savings, or we have, like a cost-benefit analysis, or other things like that. It just, from my perspective, it feels like there are other aspects of the economic benefits of projects that are should be a separate criteria versus just the resource limitations. So I will put that out there if anybody has any comments, or if that's just something to kind of talk to the boards and commissions about, whether they feel that would be a good segmentation. And then one thing, as I was looking through some of the other cities, they called out specifically the implications of deferral. So if this project was deferred, would there be additional repair costs, possible structural failure, but also a risk of possible development or other things like that that we would need to kind of consider as like a risk factor? And so I wonder if that could be worked in some way. Deputy City Administrator, go for it.
Just for clarification, Council President, so maybe the language help avoid a future cost, that doesn't cover what you're talking about. We talk about implications of deferral and risk factors.
Well, my issue with that is that's under the replacement or capital maintenance of existing infrastructure. But in some ways, what you might be looking at, so like, let's say you have an existing infrastructure and you feel like it's going to potentially fail and you want to build something new. That is avoiding a future cost. But if it's related to like an area by a stream that we want to purchase so that there isn't risk of development, that's not related to current infrastructure or maintenance. And so I think there are other risk factors there to consider in how we not only select our projects, but prioritize which ones happen in which order because of any potential risks.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then toward that idea, I'm wondering if we can work in project readiness in the idea of resource management. Because it's not so much about whether we have the staff or not, but whether or not, like, maybe the permitting has already happened or the project's already been designed and thus it's ready, shovel ready, all of that. And then another thing I noted under legal mandate on Bellevue's, they note voter-approved ballot initiatives or other kind of internal requirements to complete, that it's not always external. That's just a little minor one. But yeah, those, oh, and then the other thing, I'm wondering if there's a way to address a balance across different types of projects. One of the issues I might see is if we're talking about like life safety and all of that as a criteria, that might prioritize more transportation projects. And so I'm wondering if it would be important to consider in our prioritization whether there is a balance between types of projects. Maybe that's in kind of an equity component or, some other balancing of what the total project mix looks like.
Council President Walsh, just a question on that. So when we talk about legal requirements, either from internal or external sources, or we talk about required deferred maintenance projects, not seeing the final list yet, of course, we're still preparing it, but it could be skewed towards one or another depending on what mandates are out there, what requirements have changed. So how would you, I guess, instruct us or recommend for us to kind of bridge that gap, I guess, between if it is heavy on one side because of requirements that are coming in?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that because you're right. There might be a huge, state requirement. And so, City Administrator?
So, Council President, members of the council, there's art and science to this. And so we're trying to give you as much science as we can, but there's ultimately art. I think the Mayor Pauly's responsibility in part is to present a plan to the council, and her job is to try to then weigh those various things compared with everything else here we're talking about. So I don't know that there's a science piece to accomplishing what you're having. I think ultimately the council's going to get a plan, and you're going to hold that plan up, and you're going to say, does this meet all these various criteria, measured, unmeasured? Some of it's going to be gut, some of it's going to be, the practical applications of this with all the constraints we've talked about over the several meetings. And I think it's the mayor's responsibility to, use her best judgment and say, I've weighed all of these things working with the staff, and here's my recommendation. And then you all get to react to that. And that's, I think, that final step for the full council to step in and make those decisions.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair, and the idea that maybe it's outside of a criteria factor, but it comes into play in this art of balancing what ends up.
And again, these are all pieces of data for you. Pieces of data for the mayor, pieces of data for the boards and commissions, pieces of data for the council serving as subcommittees. There are no real absolutes to it, but it's really to help you grapple with that final decision. Does this plan of projects make sense for the community?
Yeah. Councilmember DiMichele, were you? No? Okay, fine. Scratch away. You're valid. So, do we have any other comments, questions, concerns? Administration, do we have what you need to take this forward to the wonderful boards and commissions that are going to just feast on all of this on Thursday?
We do. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I think at that, looking over our agenda, that was the last item on our agenda. Oh, we've got good of the order. Do we have any items for good of the order? No? Well, checking in. Nope. Okay, fantastic. Appreciate it. So with that, I will adjourn our meeting at 8:18 p.m. Thank you, everyone.